Hey everyone, welcome. We are gonna get going here in a few minutes. Folks into the room. Just go ahead and keep yourselves on mute, and once everybody comes in, we'll give a welcome. We'll give it just one more minute, and then we'll get going.
Hey, Eric, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, Pete.
Hey, for whatever it's worth, I want to be wherever Ned Coons is. I love his background.
Hello, Pete. How are you? We miss you.
Ned, it's so good to see you. Are you near that palm tree, or is that a virtual palm tree?
I wish it was a real palm tree, but no, it's virtual. But it's still a nice day up here in Virginia Beach. How have you been?
Awesome. Hope you have too.
We have, but we miss you.
Same.
Okay, so we've kind of slowed down with folks coming in, so we'll go ahead and get started. And if some others folks come in, we'll let them in as they come. So welcome to the first session of the WSI Summer Series for 2021. We are going to do 8 of these throughout the summer, every other week on Wednesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to go through September 15th. So we've got the first 4 out on the schedule on the wildernessskillsinstitute.org website now. So go ahead and check those out. I sent an email out to everybody on this call today that had the Zoom links in it for all 4 of those for the first 4. And I will continue to send out reminders on the Monday before the sessions start. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we'll kind of go from there. We have a really great offering of diverse subject matters and a lot of interesting people that we couldn't get necessarily in person for some of these. So stay tuned. Looking forward to having a really great series of discussions throughout the summer. I'm going to introduce the core team, the planning team for WSI this year. John Campbell, Stephen Aaron, myself, Eric Giebelstein, Natalie Lester, Morgan Somerville, and David Cohen. So we've been working since early this year to determine offerings. And then some of us were also planning the National Wilderness Skills Institute as well. So hoping to really kick this off well and have a really great series of discussions with the hopes that we get back in person in 2022 at the Cradle of Forestry in America in Pisgah Forest. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. John Campbell is the Wilderness and Wilderness Scenic Rivers Program Manager for the Southern region of the U.S. Forest Service. And then Stephen Aaron is the Trail Facilities Manager for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for the Deep South, the trail running through Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee. And they're going to be talking about the intersection of wilderness and the Appalachian Trail today. So as we get going, just please leave yourselves on mute throughout this, and I'll be monitoring the chat for questions. We'll have a series of polls. And I think that we have enough participants where we can kind of do a quick round of introductions. And John, do you want to set that up?
Sure. Yeah, we were working on, depending on how many folks joined us, we thought it'd be good to know who we have on the call, because we probably have a little extra time built in for questions and to get to know everybody. So I'm just going to go down the participant list. Just say your name and where you're from, what you do, kind of quickly, and then we'll kick off right into the presentation. So top of my list right now is Garrett Jackson. Come on camera if you like. Say hello.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't come on camera right now, but my name is Garrett Jackson. I'm in Southwest Virginia, Abingdon, near Damascus. And I work with the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail often, and I'm also a scout leader, and I was just curious to see what I can learn through this. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Garrett. Let's see, I've got a Shane. Oh, we can't hear you, Shane. We'll go to the next one really quick. Ray Taylor. Can't hear Ray either. Can anybody else hear? Let's go to the next one and maybe we'll skip intros. Olivia Acosta.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. My name is Olivia Acosta, and I work for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy as their volunteer development coordinator, and I'm located in southern New Hampshire.
Thanks, Olivia. How about Brooklyn Jewsbury? Apologies if I got your name incorrect there.
No, you got it pretty close, actually. Yeah, so I'm from North Georgia. I work for the Chattahoochee National Forest as a volunteer coordinator, and I just thought it'd be interesting to learn.
Great, thanks for joining, Brooklyn. Carly Reed.
Hi, good morning. My name is Carly Reed. I'm the Wilderness and Climbing Program Manager on the Wenatchee River Ranger District over in Leavenworth, Washington.
Great connection. Thanks, Carly. Chad.
This is Chad. I am the Recreation Program Manager, Watauga Ranger District, Cherokee National Forest.
Thanks, Chad. Deidre, good one.
Hello, my name is Jrsa. I am an EPIC member coordinator for American Conservation Experience. And I'm located out of our Asheville office, even though we're all over the place.
Thanks, Deidre. Let's see, Jason Holyfield.
Yes, hello everyone. Jason Holyfield here, working out of the supervisor's office in Asheville as a land surveyor's intern with the AmeriCorps Veterans Program.
Thanks, Jason. Jim McCauley.
Hi, I'm Jim McCauley. I'm a wilderness specialist with SAWS, working out of South Carolina this year.
Thanks, Jim. Kirsten Belcher.
Hi, Kirsten Belcher. I'm a wilderness specialist for SAWS out of the Mountain National Forest in West Virginia.
Thanks, Kirsten. And Christina McCullough.
Hi, I'm Christina McCauley. I am working with SAWS as a wilderness specialist, and I'm based out of the Asheville office.
Thanks, Christina. Leah Fitchett.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Leah Fitchett. I am a wilderness specialist who also works for SAWS. I currently live in Lewisburg, West Virginia, working on the Monongahela National Forest. But I'm originally from Blacksburg, Virginia, and will be relocating back to that general area probably in early July. So I'll be working in Virginia coming up pretty soon, but have been working in West Virginia this past year.
Great, thanks, Leah. And we have Matt.
Hey, good afternoon, y'all. Matt Helt, George Washington Jefferson National Forest, Dispersed Recreation Program Manager. And Leah, we're super stoked that you're coming back soon. Can't wait to see you.
All right, I'm gonna probably butcher this next one, but we have an M. Bousser. That's probably terrible. I apologize.
Awful. My name is Michael Bougere.
Bougere.
I work for the Forest Service at Mount Rogers in Southwest Virginia, and I manage the range program that keeps the grassy balds open on that part of the Appalachian Trail.
Great, thanks, Michael. Sorry about your name there. I got that one way off. Ned Coons.
Ned, I can see you. There we go.
Yeah. I'm from Ned Coons. I'm from the Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'm a member of the Tidewater Appalachian Trail Club, and I'm vice chair of the Virginia Regional Partnership Committee. We have a 11-mile section from Reed's Gap down to Route 56, the Tie River Bridge, and most of that is involved in the Three Ridges Wilderness area. And we're also properly trained by Pete Irvin.
Good segue, Ned. Pete, you're next.
Ned, you were doing good. I don't know that I'd ever admit that, though. Hey, hi, everybody. Excited to be here. Pete Irvin, just an old retired guy and private citizen in Vinton, Virginia, home of the Dogwood Festival.
Thanks for joining, Pete. We thought about having you just teach this session for us, but we decided to do it ourselves.
Looking forward to learning.
Scotty.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scotty Bowman. I'm Senior Wilderness Specialist and Lead Trainer with SAWS, and I'm currently based out of the North Zone of the Cherokee National Forest.
Thanks, Scotty. And last but not least, Thomas Weaver.
Hi, this is Tom Weaver. I'm with the Carolina Mountain Club. My current roles are Vice President of the club as well as the Trail Facility Manager. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and we had one intro in the chat, so monitor the chat too. Thanks for joining, Ray. I go way back with the mountain high hikers when I used to work on the Chattahoochee National Forest. So thanks for joining, everybody. We got a great mix of Forest Service folks, partners, and volunteers. So I'm excited for this conversation. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Stephen now, unless Eric has any other administrative stuff to take care of, housekeeping.
I think we're good to go.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you all so much for joining us on this afternoon. For most of us, morning for some of us. My name is, as Eric mentioned, my name is Stephen Aaron. I'm the Trail Facilities Manager for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy based out of Asheville. So I get to play around with the first 500 miles of the Appalachian Trail. Previously in 2010, a wilderness ranger internship for Sierra National Forest got me my next job with Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards in 2011, where I worked on and off for the last decade before I came to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. I am also an Eagle Scout and a Virginia Tech Hokie. So I was happy to have all you guys' introductions ahead of time so I can cherry pick my own biography. All right, if you guys give me just a second to switch over into presenting mode. All right, hopefully you guys are looking at 3 Huskies right there. All right, now PowerPoint, a little less good looking, but not as bad. So yeah, it's so today John and I are going to be kind of laying a lot of the groundwork and connections with wilderness and the Appalachian Trail. I was tasked with kind of getting said groundwork leading up to the Wilderness Act of 1964. I'm just going to go past it just for a second. But as I kept kind of looking back farther in the past, I only felt comfortable starting at particular times as far back as I could get. So forgive me if I seem off topic or jump around, especially a lot in time, but I really see a firm amount of context for exactly where wilderness got to in 1964 and where we are today with public lands. So come back with me. Archaeologists have found numerous evidence of Paleo-Native Americans in the Champlain Basin and the Hudson Valley over 13,000 years ago. That's 10,000 years before Socrates, before the pyramids of Giza were constructed, and that's 10,000 plus years of civilizations living all over North America, perhaps coming from the Bering Strait. I'm not really as concerned with that, but really just a considerable amount of time with hundreds to thousands of different tribes living all over this continent. Continued hundreds of archaeological digs have found traces of American civilization throughout tribes and ancestors, from the Calusa Lake and the Okeechobee down in Florida, the Pueblo Indians of the Anasazi, Colorado Plateau, in the Colorado Plateau, the Navajo, Hopi, Inui, Seminole, Cherokee, and so many more, again, hundreds to thousands of other different tribes that I will not try to mention at this current time. And I currently really like to throw up this map in particular, which a lot of you guys have seen, where you can look up what native land is and where you are in particular. Today, I just want to point out at the lack of coverage. There is almost no areas in this country that were not lived at some point in time. The amazing wilderness areas and public lands we've dedicated our lives to, and were and are so many things except for unlived. As we go through to preserve and protect any area, we must aim to protect the secrets of the past and continue to kind of learn from them and protect them as we protect those areas. So moving on, jumping ahead a couple thousand years, I want to go directly to 1493, a little dyslexia today. Pope Alexander VI issued the Papal bull, granting the doctrine of discovery. So this really decree aimed to justify Christian European explorers' claims on the land and waterways they allegedly discovered, and to promote Christian domination and superiority all over Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and into the Americas. It was seen as a fact that the Alabaster Christian world should dominate over the rest of the world for the sake of it and for the best of that land. So all discovered land was kind of seen as taken and as an opportunity for those colonizing. Directly to 1619, 20 Angolans were shackled and brought and anchored at the James River, brought to Jamestown, Virginia in particular. These 20 folks brought over from Africa started off the massive American chattel slave industry. And when I say James River, I included the wonderful footbridge that goes across the Appalachian Trail, because it's the same James River that thru hikers jump into from that footbridge today. Over the next 240 years, over 7 million people were taken from their homes and sold into slavery in North America. This was an infusion of forced unpaid labor that supercharged the colonial economics. Again, this is just a fact of what was going on. 7 million people at a time were brought over that really changed the landscape of exactly how we moved into this country. So over the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, Spain, France, and America and the British colonies invaded North America. Conflicts among colonizers and natives were inevitably violent. These major powers established flourishing economic settlements, trading and learning from the locals, but generally treating Native Americans as others at best. Colonies were supported from large empires abroad and militaries to help move into new land. Those massive colonies were, and established empires were happy to take in all the resources that they could from this new, again, land to them. And again, this is not new news to everyone. We know the story. Treaties were made and broken with Native Americans hunted, eradicated, and legislated as a nuisance to be cleared for whites and Christian dominion and superiority throughout the land. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing the removal of indigenous people, including the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee people from their ancestral lands, mostly in southern states, in exchange to lands to become parts of Oklahoma. It's the Indian Removal Act that planned and mandated the Trail of Tears, where over 4,000 of 15,000 indigenous people were forced, 4,000 or 15,000 died on their way over to those lands in Oklahoma. So with that distinguished history, this is normally where I've picked up a lot of this talk. So with the removal of all those natives and hundreds of thousands in the preceding decades, America had entered a space where they needed more Americans to take all those new lands, enter Manifest Destiny. And this picture that a lot of people are most familiar with on the left, American Progress by John Gast in 1872. So just on a hard bullet points, Manifest Destiny was a widely held cultural belief in the 19th century United States that its settlers were destined to expand across North America. There are three basic themes to Manifest Destiny that were found throughout. The special virtues of American people and their institutions, the missions of the United States to redeem and remake the West in their image, in the agrarian image, an irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty to take on the American land that was our duty to steward and take over. So again, it was very much built into the culture and society that it wasn't a question of what should be done, but that it needed to be done, that white people needed to move into these space. The greatest way for us to do this was with the Homestead Act of 1862, which provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the United States government can claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. Claimants were required to improve that plot of land, but very much that was just really required to stay on that. This one policy allowed 1.5 million households to receive 246 million acres of land. More importantly, it provided a tangible asset that could also be benefited for future generations. Citizens with few assets could find any unoccupied 160 acres and really file for that and stay on that land for that period of time, and it could be theirs. The Homestead Act opened land ownership to male citizens, widows, single women, and immigrants pledging to become citizens. In 1868, the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment guaranteed that African Americans were eligible as well. Black homesteaders, very much at the last aspect, were then used to be able to get some small tracts of land, but less than 1% of the tracts of land that were given out. Up to 30% of the current wealth of today can be traced back to the Homestead Act, because again, 160 acres of tangible resources passed over the generations would be considerable in the modern day. Moving on and jumping on to further later on in the 19th century, Americans continued to keep moving west with that Manifest Destiny and getting those 160 acres. Country's population rose. We kept killing and boxing up Native American territories and kept moving into the land. Newly freed slaves were finally free from slavery, only to find white supremacy, Jim Crow laws, and the KKK to help keep them from prospering. The Industrial Revolution brought an exponential increase to efficiency and quality that changed everything. That Manifest Destiny worked all too well with the large-scale logging, mining, and accompanying water pollution. So as we moved into the 19th century, and as we're in this big picture of conservation, as much as it would have been nice to only preserve parks, the main thing that came to the 1891, in my humble opinion, that came to the 1891 Forest Reserve Act was a massive amount of water pollution. I've recently thrown in this cartoon to the left here, the Weeks Act story. Which was the point of the Weeks Act was to buy big pieces of land for the government, which was a new idea, sure, but it was very much to figure out better ways to keep these massive logging scales away from these watersheds. Even though this was a time where we were seemingly so far away from our current industrialized societies, we saw many times where the major headwaters for the Chattanooga ran brown because of logging operations, and a lot of other major metropolitan areas suffered because of big watershed failures. So again, moving back, and then we have the big dog. You can see a picture of him in the bottom right, good old Teddy Roosevelt, the bull moose himself. He started his first of two terms in 1901 and passed and did a number of other things, including the Antiquities, passing the Antiquities Act, or saw the passage of the Antiquities Act rather, which made it which made it popular for a president, or possible for a president to grant executive orders for lands in particular areas. Prior to Roosevelt, only one president had issued over 200 executive orders. Grover Cleveland issued 253. The first 25 presidents issued 1,200 executive orders. Roosevelt issued over 1,000. By the end of his second term in office, Roosevelt used executive orders to establish 150 million acres of reserved forestry land. At the same time, there was a lot of the country that was focused on a lot of other social causes, and very pertinent aspects of life. There was major worker-initiated labor strikes movement to actually carve out the life that we can see today. There's a picture on the left shows that how drastic of a time at the same time that Benton MacKay was coming up with the idea for the Appalachian Trail. We just passed the centennial of June 1st, the Tulsa race massacre, where again, black neighborhoods were invaded and torched. People were pulled from their homes in the middle of sleep and killed. Women fought for the right to vote in 1919 and 1920. With the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, so they could still legally be discriminated against. Again, I provide this, again, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, even before this, was the first significant law restricting immigration in the United States, which would continue for decades on. I bring this up because there is a dissonance with why there's so many strictly white males focusing on the start of the Appalachian Trail, public lands in general. There are a number of societal reasons y'all are available on, but it's also very important context to show what is else going on at this exact same time. I don't mention it later on, but of course, a lot of us know that 1964, when the Wilderness Act passes, that's the same year as the Civil Rights Act passage. So again, very important to not think asynchronously and to think in the current times. But that's the women's suffrage movement itself, and one of its greatest heroes that brought the very inspiration for the Appalachian Trail. So one of the names that is not very well known, that is key, the one individual who could be put at the inspiration for the Appalachian Trail is Jessie Belle Hardy, seen right here. Jessie Belle Hardy was born in 1876 in Chicago. Hardy passionately dedicated her life to helping others in women's suffrage. She worked her way to the head of surgical nursing in a major Chicago hospital, only to marry a doctor, Gurney Stubbs. When her first husband died, she moved to New York and focused on a graduate degree from Columbia in the School of Philanthropy, and became the legislative chair of the Women's Peace Suffrage Society. I mention all this because in 1916, she would, actually, I'm sorry, in 1912, Jessie organized a hike, one of the first of its kinds, going from New York City all the way to Albany into the government's house, again, pushing for women's suffrage and the women's right to vote. In 1916, she would marry her second husband and the only wife to have, Benton MacKay. They would split their time between New York City and the Hudson Valley. Benton MacKay was also a passionate social activist and protested on behalf of women's suffrage, but would spend a lot of his times in the late teens trying to go back and forth for the sake of his wife's health. Jessie Belle Hardy Stubbs MacKay at this time in the late 1916s and 17s fell ill, and a great amount of anxiety ended up leading to suicide, ending her life, or I'm sorry, her depression becoming fatal and her falling victim to suicide. It is quite the understatement to say that Ben was heartbroken. He watched his favorite person in the world succumb to the pressures of modern life and based in a frustration, anxiety, disappointments in women's suffrage. Hardy Stubbs MacKay did find solace in the outdoors, and that was one of the biggest lessons that Ben MacKay himself took on. And from the ashes of this tragedy started the idea of the best damn trail in the entire world. So Ben MacKay, in the following year of the death of his wife, Ben MacKay wrote an article in criticism of the growing industrializing society and Ben MacKay's project in industrial regional planning. He claimed that America has been robbed of its leisure time and would benefit from a new structure to be able to enjoy themselves. Again, to provide a little bit more context to this, at this time in this current increase to industrialized society, it was not normal for people to have more than the afternoon on Saturday off. Getting Saturday afternoons off in addition to the Sabbath on Sunday, just began to start coming in the 1890s when football really started to pick up. So again, people were being worked well over 40 hours a week, a 40-hour work week not being taken on legislatively until just before the Second World War, in almost 20 years from now. So Ben MacKay published this document with the idea of the Appalachian Trail, really talking about different ways for people to get out of the industrialized society, to work at different work camps, to be able to have some kind of cooperation to make this thing happen, that locals needed to be invested in, that volunteers needed to do the majority of the work, because volunteer work is really play, and the spirit of cooperation as such is usual in such enterprises, and it should be stimulated throughout. Is that it's really that the aspect of that play was really robbed, and that the fact that locals needed to be invested in it to continue the protection of it. Again, at this current time, in the 1920s, vegetation to the United States Forest Service system was around 4 million people. So over the next 40 years, from 1921 to 1925, Ben Mackay spent a lot of time lobbying and guarding enough support for the next 4 years for the Appalachian Trail. By 1925, Ben Mackay, with a bunch of other Mainers, including Myron Avery, the other gentleman that you see on the right, started organizing and started the Appalachian Trail Conference. Despite laying out an original utopian vision of a commune Appalachian oasis on the Appalachian Trail, Ben Mackay, Myron Avery, and a lot of those folks by 1925 really focused on the trail itself to get started and the foundation for all this. But it was not so over the next 16 years, or I'm sorry, over the next 12 years, Myron Avery and a lot of different Mainers and Northeasterners would connect a lot of different trails and blaze a lot of different trails through handshake agreements and private land to connect an Appalachian Trail from Mount Oglethorpe to Mount Washington. Soon after that, though, Myron Avery took the baton and started as the first executive director of the Appalachian Trail Conference in 1937. We started to learn that it was a lot more difficult than it seemed to just connect a trail. In 1938, a hurricane severely damaged the trail in New England, making it a lot harder for it to be connected. And with a lot of folks being called up to World War II, Myron Avery included, it stayed blocked for a significant amount of time. Handshake agreements that connected the original Appalachian Trail started to erode, were broken, were sold, lands were sold off. And some locals did not take kindly to a lot of foreign folks being brought to their backyard. My favorite example of that is also the first example of the Appalachian Trail or maintainers hiring a contractor. In 1933, when the volunteers of the Pacific Appalachian Trail Club started to build the Rangeview shelter that we're looking at right here, beautiful shelter, volunteers came to the worksite one day to find the materials vandalized. It would happen repeatedly over and over again as they were making the shelter before leading to an altercation. A local gang led by Jerry Sowers accosted the volunteer trail maintainers and stoned them away, saying that they didn't want any outsiders coming to this area. Throwing rocks, they hit some skin, but didn't necessarily do anything past just that. But the PATC got a message that they needed to do more to help protect against this. They went directly to the local sheriff, who did nothing because he did not see the PATC as constituents he needed to do anything about. The trail maintainers have never been the type to buckle under pressure, so they broke ground and, like I said, hired their very first contractor. A man named Charlie Sisk was serving a jail term for killing a man in a drunken bar fight. Sisk had a reputation for two things: being a violent thug and being an excellent stonemason. The PATC hired Sisk straight out of jail when he got done with his service, and they went to work with a volunteer crew. The first time Sisk and his crew were met by the local Sowers thugs, the Sowers gang walked up to them with rocks, and the volunteer crews and Sisk happily smiled at them, waved while brandishing 3 shotguns. There was never any issues or any problems with this shelter going on. And as you can see, it is standing to this day from its construction in 1933. Continuing on, as Myron Avery pushed on, he started his first of 7 terms, like I said, in 1937, as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's chair. He would die by a heart attack just months before stepping down of the Appalachian Trail Conservancies due to health reasons. This started the rich tradition of nonprofit executive directors working themselves to death. Throughout Avery's reign as the executive director, Murray Stevens, a New York man, and Stanley Murray of Tennessee also started to garner more local support in their regions around the trail. There were a lot of different connections, but a lot of which came directly through Myron Avery, and it was that much more important to provide that much local support, so you didn't have local gangs kicking up things all over the all around. So in the first 40 years of the Appalachian Trail, getting up to this point in 1961, where Stanley Murray took over as the ATC chair, the Appalachian Trail Conference had only 380 members. Over the next couple of years, Stanley Murray would continue to grow that chair and membership in that coalition from 380 to over 10,000. The Appalachian Trail Conference grew and learned a couple definitive lessons again and again over those years. It was crucial to get local buy-in for management and maintenance, and the trail needed a lot more of a handshake for its protection. The ATC was ready for a big change, and the country was ready too, with just on the precipice of a lot of other things. Hopping on back out of the trail world, in 1962, another amazing book, just as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was the straw that broke the camel's back to start the Civil War. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring sent shockwaves throughout America and really started and kicked off the environmental movement. As much as I'm always happy to jump right in to talk about the Wilderness Act, it's really Silent Spring that started the dominoes to a lot of the major pieces of legislation that we'll see over the next 3 slides. So bam, our favorite. The Wilderness Act really provided this highest form of protection that we could hope on. I'm not going to go too deep on this because we will continue to talk about the Wilderness Act, but in 1964, that was one of the first major pieces of legislation. I bolded in order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement. We'll see exactly why going on. So as we see in the 1964 Wilderness Act, this really protected some of our, dare I pull the Park Service term of the crown jewels, but a lot of the prettiest pristine areas that had not been logged and moved over and touched in the past. At the same time, there are plenty of other areas that have been populated or very popular trails that could use a similar level of protection, enter the National Trail System Act of 1968. So again, in order to provide for an ever-increasing outdoor recreation. So I see a lot of these two laws as a lot of two different sides of the same coin, of really trying to provide the recreational opportunities for an ever-expanding society and protect the areas that could have all sorts of forces coming abound even before those forces even exist. Quick shout out to the Office of the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, who was crucial in both of these pieces of legislation. Lady Bird took on the beautification of the country as her calling for the protection of public spaces as she was First Lady. Again, a major piece that was vital for these pieces of legislation. The first passage of this registration protected long trails we know and love, like the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, but have expanded on to wonderful other less known, but also imperative trails or important trails like the Overmountain Victory Trail, like I heard mentioned before. The Land Water Conservation Fund of 1968. So as the National Trail System Act also provided some opportunities for to buy land to create the more scenic route of the Appalachian Trail, the Land Water Conservation Fund provided some kind of a funding structure to continue to buy lands of importance, to continue to add on to the public land system. This creating the funding structure, pulling property taxes, fuel taxes, and extraction revenues has really been an essential part of the expansion of our continued public lands and stands to this day. It cannot be understated how much that the continuation of the Land Water Conservation Fund helps to cherry pick and buy and support a lot of major programs and crucial acreage. While 8 million acres honestly doesn't sound like a ton of acres over the last 50 years, I know how clutch of acres of headwaters of corridor along the Appalachian Trail those have been, especially thinking about the massive amount of industrialization and continued growth we've seen over the last 50 years. So, and again, if it wasn't for those pieces of legislation, if it wasn't for the hard protection, there's other forces of 1964 that could have been moving from. In 1964, as well as we had the birth of the Wilderness Act, we also had the birth of Jeff Bezos. I could not be more thrilled that we have the Wilderness Act to protect us from a future that could have looked like this. Amazon warehouses all over the beautiful Linville Gorge with drones dropping off things all over the place. Thank you guys so much for letting me do this roundabout kind of backup to get to a lot of, we got to a different wilderness. I know we have a lot of different professionals on this call, and I didn't want to hit the same old facts and timeline that we've seen a lot of times. So I'm just getting off presenting mode and seeing any level of chat. I'm happy to cite any sources for anything that I've said through an email after this. But that is my lead up to the Wilderness Act and where we are today. I'm going to pass over to John, and I'll see y'all again in a bit.
Thanks, Stephen. That was great. Definitely a new take and perspective, which is always good to see. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Just a reminder, use the chat box. If you do have a question, if we do have an opportune time that we can, excuse me, sorry, I'm getting set up here. Have an opportune time to break into the conversation, we will. Let's see here. So yeah, I can't see the chat as you go, but I'll leave it with Stephen and Eric to coordinate. So like Eric said in the beginning, my name is John Campbell. I'm the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic River Program Manager for the Southern region of the Forest Service. I've been doing this job for about almost 4 years now. I worked on the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest in a few positions for about 7 years before that. And I was out west in Utah for about 10 years before that. So enjoying this position and looking forward to talking to you guys a little bit today. Keeping this very informal, like we've said, looking for conversation and questions. Might not get a lot in the beginning part of my presentation, where we're going to kind of do a little bit of a crash course on wilderness and the Wilderness Act. And then we're going to kind of talk about some of those intersections of management that maybe some of us have dealt with before, and hopefully generate some conversations and examples, and maybe we can actually do a little problem solving today. One housekeeping thing, my children have expressed instructions to not disturb me, but that almost ensures that they will. So we'll see if that happens or not. And I can't see the chat, but I had made a note for myself. If you want to pop one of your favorite spots on the Appalachian Trail that's in wilderness, go ahead and do that in the chat just for some context and kind of see where folks are coming from. And I'll go ahead and get started a little bit here. Here we go. All right, so Stephen talked about the Wilderness Act. Pardon me. Gonna hit on a couple just of the key points here, a little bit of the key takeaways of the language. Let's see here. Oh, darn it. Okay. The act was primarily authored by Howard Zahniser over the course of about 8 years. 66 revisions to that act that represented multiple compromises and changes as that act developed and was what we have today. The Wilderness Act is something that I refer to a lot. It's commonly referred to as having some poetic language, but its words and the law that came out of it is very powerful, and something that I would recommend you looking into a little bit more if you haven't read through some of the more introductory parts, sections 1, 2, maybe 3 and 4 a little bit. Really have some great language in there, and I put a couple of them in here. The act established the National Wilderness Preservation System. That's for the Forest Service and the other 3 land management agencies, for the permanent good of the whole people. That really gets at wilderness is not just for those that use it. There are a lot of folks that see the value in that it merely exists, and we're not just managing it for the locals or, like I said, people that use it. This is for everybody. This is for all Americans. It developed a national policy to preserve wilderness, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But it mandates to the agencies through Congress we will uphold the standards that we're going to manage wilderness to what the act says. It's a counterbalance to population increases, settlement, mechanization. I think Stephen hit on this. Humans do not modify and occupy all areas. It's really important. It's going to look a little bit different, and where man is a visitor. We should always remember that one. And one of my favorites of the last is secure for the American people, a present and future generations, the benefit of an enduring resource of wilderness. Enduring resource, man, that really has a lot of power to it. It means we're going to have this for a long time, and we're all tasked with making sure that we're doing the best that we can for it. So the definition, it's interesting that the one of the definitions is used, or the definition is to say what it is not, where it says a wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape. Wilderness should be different. These are places that you don't have what you have at your house. You don't even have the things you have at your campground sometimes. These are really important words that we manage for, that have trickled down over time into our policy and other things that we do. But there's reasons that people want to go to these places. It does get you away from the hustle and bustle of modern society. You'll notice I put in the chat, I saw on one of those slides from Stephen, is a way to deal with the problem of living, I think is what it was, which I hadn't seen that before, but it really, somehow I focused in on that one point. And this language from the Wilderness Act is, to me, gets at that. Man and his own works don't dominate the landscape. Get away. You know, there's a lot of value in getting back to nature, so to speak. So the act goes on to kind of further define what wilderness is, and it's commonly called wilderness character. It has 5 parts, and we'll go through these a little bit to discuss what those are. The first one is untrammeled. Many of you have heard what this is. It's a very commonly misinterpreted or misunderstood word. It's not untrampled. It doesn't mean you're out there, you know, stepping on bugs and grass and trees and whatnot. This is free from human action, primarily agency action, but it's free from human manipulation. This is the essence of humility and restraint in humans trying to do what is best for an ecosystem or a wilderness area. We should be hands off. Second quality is undeveloped. This gets at the primeval character without permanent improvements. This is where man and his works do not dominate the landscape. This one primarily focuses in on non-recreational developments, things like communication towers, administrative sites, other developments that aren't technically used for recreation. Second is natural. This one connects a lot with untrammeled a little bit, but it's natural is primarily affected by the forces of nature. This is where we should be preserving native species and ecological patterns, and you know, letting the ecosystem do what it needs to do to go through natural progressions. The fourth one is solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. This one's kind of split into 2. Solitude. This is a place where you can get away. This is where you can have, you know, a level of healing, an emotional connection with nature. And the primitive unconfined recreation, where you have solitude and freedom, and test yourself, where you can hone traditional skills of being in the backcountry. And then the final one is other features of value. Oftentimes this goes to cultural resources of a particular area. This one is, if we are to identify another feature of value, it must be integral to that particular wilderness area. Sometimes it's contained in the enabling legislation, other times it's identified in different ways through wilderness character monitoring or other processes. But oftentimes as well, other national designations are considered another feature of value, such as the Appalachian Trail, other national historic scenic trails, wild and scenic rivers, those types of designations that come from Congress that may or may not be integral to that particular wilderness, but they are oftentimes part of that process. You'll see a quote off to the right from the Wilderness Act again. I've highlighted preserving wilderness character. It comes up in the Act a few times. It's the primary mandate of the Wilderness Act to the agencies, is we must be preserving wilderness character. That's these 5 qualities off to the side, and how we measure those, and that we're not decreasing those. We don't have a mandate to improve it. We just shouldn't be letting things get worse in many cases. And, you know, that's a tall order. You know, there's lots of stuff going on, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things here in a little bit. I actually just realized I can see the chat. So if there's anything that needs to come up, or Eric, feel free to stop me. But it looks like we've had some good discussions in the chat there. All right. Wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the clauses in the Wilderness Act. This one is going to come under the prohibited uses, and this leads to some of the future discussions I hope to have at a little bit later in the call. Quote, there shall be no commercial enterprise, permanent road, temporary road, motor vehicles, motorized equipment, motorboats, aircraft, mechanical transport structures, and its installations. If I could see you all on camera, or if we were sitting in a room together, I'd ask you if any of you have ever seen any of these things in wilderness. And I would bet every single one of you would raise your hand that you have seen those. I don't want to say it's common, but they exist, and there's reasons that they exist. And we're going to chat about those just briefly here. There are 4 exceptions to those prohibited uses. The first one is except as specifically provided for in this act. So if it's in the Wilderness Act or in subsequent legislation, oftentimes there are ways to allow for those prohibited uses. Subject to existing private rights, that gets it to inholdings and other private rights where they still might have those in minerals and a few other things. Other provisions of law, that's where there are other laws that also have a positive action role. Say that we have to do stuff. So that's where we're going to talk maybe a little bit here about the intersection of the Wilderness Act, the National Historic Scenic Trails Act, and how those things come together. And then the 4th one, which is the more common one and the one that many of you on this call have worked on before it, is except as necessary to meet the minimum requirements for the administration of the area for the purpose of this act. Got the minimum requirements highlighted there. The title of the slide is Minimum Requirements Analysis. This is where there are needs to do things in wilderness sometimes. We want to identify what the minimum is. The key is, I could have gone through and highlighted a couple other sections of this number 4 exception, which is for the purposes of this act. It's a very key part in that we have to do it for wilderness purposes. We don't do this for the benefit of, a plant, for example, or for recreation uses. These have got to be put together and analyzed and developed in a way that we're going to be either preserving or improving wilderness character in often ways to do this work. All right, I throw this one on there. You can see the little cartoon. I use that more as a joke, but in no way represents what happens out on the forest to the letter of the law. But the minimum requirements analysis as part of the Wilderness Act requires us to do this work. And the minimum requirements decision guide, or MRDG, which some of you have probably heard, is a process developed by the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center for the purpose of completing a defensible minimum requirements analysis that informs decision making. In theory, this process should be done before any NEPA or other decisions are made. The hope is that this informs what the preferred course of action should be. And oftentimes these are done once some managers might have in their head, or line officers. I don't think we have any line officers on the call today, so I'll make them the bad guy. But sometimes you have in your head what you already want to do, and you make the MRDG say that. It's not how it's supposed to work, but we do our best to make sure we're trying not to do that. All right, just a couple of wilderness stats nationally. In 1964, we had 9.1 million acres. Forget the number of areas. There were only 3 areas designated from the Act in 1964 in the eastern United States. Linville Gorge, which Stephen showed a picture of with drones flying over it in North Carolina, Shining Rock in North Carolina as well, and then the Great Gulf, I believe up in New Hampshire is the other location. And that's not if you don't count the Boundary Waters canoe area. Over time, you can see today we have over 111 million acres. That's roughly about the size of California. 50% of that is in Alaska. 103 areas in the National Wilderness Preservation System and 448 in the Forest Service. Forest Service manages the most numbers of wilderness areas. I believe the Park Service manages the most acres, mainly in part to everything that's in Alaska. So just to break things up a little bit, just for fun, I believe the poll is anonymous, but I'm going to throw, Eric's going to throw up a quick poll just for fun to see what folks think. So go ahead, Eric.
Getting close there. Just a couple more people need to answer.
$17 out of 19, that's pretty good. We have a small sample size, and like I said, this is just for fun. And I know to many of you, I may be preaching to the choir a little bit, but yeah, it looks like we could use a little more wilderness in the Southeast, and I would tend to agree. You know, it's we have these little, well, I'll hold off on that really quick. So let's see, let me stop that and go to my next poll or my next slide, and then we'll talk a little bit more here. So here's just a couple of local stats for the Southeast. We have 87 wilderness areas in the southern region of the Forest Service. That's the most areas of any Forest Service region. But we only have about 800,000 acres. That is just dwarfed by almost every other Forest Service region around the country. You guys know there's, you know, wilderness areas larger than the total acreage in the entire southern region. So that's one of the, you know, we have a lot of areas, and they comprise some very important places throughout the southern region, especially as we talk about the Southern Apps and that core important corridor that goes along the Appalachian Trail as well. The AT per Stephen this year is 2,193.1 miles. Like Stephen mentioned, I didn't get the stat. I didn't want to put anything that was incorrect, but about 500 miles of that is in, I think the Deep South, and then we add Virginia, which is, I believe, is another 250, give or take. I'll let maybe Pete put something in the chat if he has a figure that we should know, but quite a bit. And most of the Appalachian Trail in the Southeast is on public land. Which is awesome. Between the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest in North Carolina, the Cherokee, the George Washington Jefferson, and then Shenandoah and the Great Smokies. So lots of protection there. The AT traverses 24 wilderness areas, 18 in the southern region, 1 in Shenandoah, and then 5 in the eastern region as it gets up into the northeast a little bit further. Approximately 150 miles in wilderness, 125 in the southern region, which aligns kind of closely with a lot of other connections with wilderness trails versus overall trail stats. We're in that, you know, 5 to 7% range of the trail is in wilderness. All right, so management intersection. This is where we're going to switch it up a little bit. We're going to be a little bit more informal. I'm going to encourage questions. We have another poll coming up just for fun, and we might even do a breakout room, depending on if we think there's a good need for that. So really, I encourage questions. Throw them in the chat, and then Stephen or Eric will stop me at a logical spot, and we can have a conversation if anyone has something to add. So the way that I view the intersection of some of these, you know, very important laws is our objective is to best meet the intent of both of them. Or anytime that some of these very important laws come together, we want to do our best so that there's a win on both ends if ever possible. Sometimes that's not possible, but that's generally what my objective is. When it comes to wilderness and the AT and the Forest Service, there's a long history of coordination and mutual trust. I've been in the southern region for about 10 years now, and I think one of the first things I did was went to a Southern Partnership meeting for the Appalachian Trail, and then shortly after that, I in managing our wilderness areas on the Blue Ridge district there, started working with SAWS with wilderness rangers and doing wilderness stewardship work, and we've always worked well together. The partnership for WSI is the ATC, SAWS, and the Forest Service. Very important that we all work together, and I think there's usually a very common goal and vision for what we're trying to do. Let's see, and then there's obviously forest plan direction for the AT and wilderness. We have Forest Service manuals that also help that out. So there's other documents that guide us through this process. But there's sometimes, things that need to be discussed. There's a lot of values in place when you talk about wilderness and the Appalachian Trail. And people have strong feelings about it. And, it's managers and volunteers and our partners often face difficult decisions and difficult problems that arise. It's just the nature of what we do. So as we go forward into a couple of other slides here, I want to remind folks we're not making any decisions today. We're just highlighting where these things intersect, and respect others' opinions if they do come out, or if you don't agree with mine. Like I said, there's some of this, a lot of this stuff lives in a gray area sometimes, but this was the whole point of this webinar, was to have some conversations and hear what folks have to say. So let's dive right in. We good on the chat, Eric?
All good.
Okay, I don't see any questions. All right. All right, shelters. I should have pulled up the stat. There's several dozen shelters along the AT, and I think in the southern region. Most shelters were in place before wilderness designation. And like I mentioned earlier on about the Wilderness Act, there's reports that mention when these are being designated. I'm sure there were advocates, on both sides, talking to congressional staffers about what's important about these areas. And the Appalachian Trail, I'm sure, was one of those, and the facilities at the time that went along with them to preserve, at the time, many of the wilderness areas that were probably designated in the 80s, 90s, 2000s along the Appalachian Trail. They're contained in reports. There's a discussion of intent for those particular areas, but they aren't contained in law, which gets into one of those squishy little areas sometimes, especially when a tree falls on one, or a roof needs to be replaced, or certain things like that.
And just to hop in real quick, John, some context I meant to give you before. So yeah, out of the 265 shelters currently on the Appalachian Trail, some are repaired that are currently in wilderness, but there are no new shelters after a wilderness designation. As John mentioned before, out of all those wilderness in the Appalachian Trail in 1964, only the Great Gulf around Mount Washington is the only one on the Appalachian Trail. So all designations of those 23 other ones after that were designated around the Appalachian Trail.
Gotcha. Thanks, Stephen. So, and Stephen, jump in here again anytime, please. So it's probably a bit of an understatement that the shelters and their particular locations are really part of the experience, part of either through hiking or section hiking, or even the weekend hikers, backpackers, or even day trippers, is to visit some of these iconic locations. This is one that I had a picture of, Blood Mountain Shelter on the Chattahoochee Oconee, built by the CCC. Super cool structure. And it's a destination point. Not only is it the highest point on the AT in Georgia, you got this cool shelter, amazing views all around. and it's a busy place. You can see the bare dirt, and that extends for lots of space around there. So we're getting a lot of visitation there. So that's one of the, and these are just discussion topics. I'm not advocating for anything as we go through this. Two things I wanted to bring up is oftentimes shelters are now such these destination points. They bring a lot of people there, and you know what that when you have a lot of people, you have a lot of resource damage. That's one management factor that I know both Forest Service and ATC and the AT clubs all work on to try to mitigate that. But we're probably, there's probably some detractions from wilderness character in some ways when there's that many people in the facility in some cases. The other one with shelters that's, occasionally comes across my desk and probably many of yours is when these shelters need substantial maintenance. I don't have the exact language, but there's a standard that we should at least have a discussion about should that shelter be moved out of wilderness as part of the maintenance. To my knowledge, I don't think any have been, or none have been decommissioned in wilderness. Anybody correct me if I'm wrong there. But we should at least be having that discussion. And it's a fun discussion because, I think we all understand both sides of that, where folks are coming from there. And it's also connected to what my next slide is going to talk about. Which sometimes connected to shelters. We have everyone's favorite thing is privies. I know a lot of these privies, I believe, well, some of the shelters and privies, it might have been the same decision, were done, somebody help me out here, probably 20 to 30 years ago, to develop a series of privies, and I think shelters probably outside wilderness, to manage the use along the Appalachian Trail. As much as privies aren't a very pretty sight, the alternative of having human waste and everything that goes along with that in high quantities is equally as not a good sight. And we're managing it. There's, these are ways to minimize the fecal coliform issues, protect the resources that are immediately surrounding these high use areas, usually associated with shelters where you have, oftentimes dozens or more people camping and needing to use the restroom. And I think this is a wilderness one, other than it has a roof on it. I believe the ones in the Chattahoochee didn't have roofs on them. So I wanted to make a connection to wilderness character. I talked about this a little bit. This is really an impact to the solitude and the unconfined recreation quality of wilderness character, because it's basically taking people should be relying on their skills and the freedom to do what they want to do out there. And when you camp at a shelter and you've got a toilet to go use, not a lot different than being, for example, in a low development campground and having those facilities. But like I said, we've got this trade-off between this extremely high use trail and these shelters, which bring in a lot of people. And I can't imagine before some of these privies were in, I mean, the use has probably, just exploded since they were put in. But even the decision was made then to put them in, I can imagine the level of human waste and challenges that folks were dealing with.
Yeah, I can tell you that, John, just to hop in specifically on that, a particular phenomenon that tons of thru hikers are doing in particular is brown blazing, which is going from privy location to privy location, especially in the beginning, because the idea of pooping outside, as we all know, for some reason is intellectually devastating at first. So people will really start to seek them out and go to them, at least plan their stops and overnight stays. So it's something to know. It's the most popular facility. If we ever wanted to draw people in one direction, we would build a privy there.
Hey, that's great, and kind of a good segue, because I was going to point out the maintenance on these things. I've been a part of a complete privy bin switch, at least what the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club calls theirs, where you flip the side with the riser on it over to an empty bin, and you empty out the other side. And talk about not fun. And it's almost exclusively done with volunteer labor, packing wood chips in, packing garbage out, and just a all around unenjoyable process. So part of that makes me wonder about the sustainability of those things. Is continuing to do that and moving privies. It's just such a massive workload. And, I think sometimes you think, oh, well, volunteers are doing it, so it's not a thing on the agency, but yeah, we're still looking out for our volunteers as well. And I 100% get it too. Volunteers are very protective of their facilities that they maintain. They work their behinds off almost on a probably weekly basis to do not only trail work, but the stuff with the facilities too. So, and yeah, it's the alternative is picking up exposed human waste that hasn't decomposed properly. But like I said, shelters and privies together, they create a different experience that one normally wouldn't classify as a true wilderness experience. And yeah, just throwing that out there for discussion. And as part of that, this might start some of the discussion, and I'll, Eric, you want to put up the next poll?
Yeah, John, should I put up the second poll or the third poll?
Oh, I skipped the second poll, didn't I?
Yeah, we'll come back to it maybe.
Okay. Yeah, do the third one.
Okay.
Remember, there's no right or wrong answers here. Just hopefully to prompt some discussion.
Well, I like this question. My still boss, Morgan Somerville, now director of Business Use Management on the Appalachian Trail, could answer it. I know what he would answer. he thinks that through hikers should carry wag bags, though. So.
A couple more, if there's anyone out there still looking to vote.
Not.
What's that, Pete?
Yeah, sorry, technology getting the better of me. Couldn't find the poll for a while, but it's because I was.
Well, it's very interesting because it's, we're basically split into quarters for the most part, give or take a little bit. Yes to privies only was the most, but 5 out of 18, I believe, polled, or 5 out of 14. So yeah, I just, honestly, I came up with that poll question this morning. I was just kind of curious. And that would make you wonder how, the partnership of the Forest Service, the AT clubs, and ATC would have dealt with the use over the last 30 years if it was a hard no to privies and shelters, or privies only, those types of things, because most of the shelters were there already. But just very interesting. Doing a time check here. I've got a few more slides. I think we'll skip breakout rooms and maybe just go to open discussion once I'm wrapped up with the presentation. And if there's questions, or if there's something about this one you want to talk more about, I know there's been a couple of examples recently, in the southern region revolving around this conversation. So happy to discuss those a little bit more too. All right. All right, blazing and signs. Another intersection of management here a little bit. Obviously, there's just different between inside wilderness and outside wilderness. general policy is that it's kept to a minimum, which I know is not a great standard. You know, blazing and signs should be there when outside of wilderness to help folks from getting lost, basically. You know, at trail junction, so folks know where to go. But in wilderness, it's a little bit different. It shouldn't be for the convenience of the user. There shouldn't be interpretive signs nor informational signs. You can see that sign off to the side there that gives destination locations. I believe the proper signage standard for in the wilderness is just a trail number and a distance to help folks, you know, continue to have that unconfined recreation opportunity and challenge themselves. You know, hopefully folks have a map sometimes to help navigate. And obviously no informational interpretive signs. Those are usually at trailheads where folks can get information about where they're going, what wilderness is, a little more information about the area maybe, but then once you're in there, you're in there, and there shouldn't be any more signs.
Hey, John,
oh, hey, Pete, go ahead.
I just feel like throwing in that in most national forests in the South, there's a forest plan standard in which blazing of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail is allowed. And on some national forests in the South, there's a wilderness that blazing is not out on any trails other than the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. So a forest plan requirement, not a Wilderness Act or National Trail System Act or other requirement in some cases.
Thanks for that clarification, Pete. Yeah, and you're right. This is my references come from our Forest Service manual. And I think that forest plan direction is probably tiered to this, which is kept to a minimum. I think there are, from what I remember, we can't go out and blaze every tree or other, at the frequency as non-wilderness locations. It's at least at a reduced level, especially in places where the trail is easily found. But yeah, I appreciate that, and I need to make a note to update this one to bring in that information. I appreciate that, Pete. The one unique management challenge I was going to bring up relating to blazing and signs is multiple times when I was on the Chattahoochee, and I think I've heard it from even other locations, is to put up mile markers along the Appalachian Trail and through wilderness. Wilderness is probably one of the more common places people get lost, and to put those additional signs up. And to my knowledge, that hasn't happened, at least in wilderness, but it's just one of those other interesting challenges that comes up with this. All right, trail maintenance, specifically Appalachian Trail maintenance. As most of you know, regular maintenance, basic maintenance, clearing trees, obviously with a crosscut, doing minor tread work, approved blazing, other things that are, part of just basic trail maintenance is approved. I would still recommend you coordinate with your local Forest Service office for my AT volunteers that are on the call, which I know you do, just to make sure everything's okay. But those things are approved at that level as you coordinate with the ranger district office. Crosscut versus chainsaw, as you guys know, chainsaws are prohibited in wilderness. And one of the interesting parts, things that's kind of come up as a challenge as well, is you can't even possess a chainsaw in wilderness. technically that is, against the law. We've had requests to, carry a chainsaw through, and we've never approved one that I'm aware of. So just keep that in mind. Structures, I know the AT uses water bars in many cases and other structures to help manage the trail and keep it sustainable and keep water moving off of it. Depending on the size and scope of some of those structures, the smaller ones can be approved in coordination with your district and forest. Other larger ones, if you're thinking about a bridge or substantial walls or other things, you might want to reach out to myself, or make sure you're coordinating to make sure we're doing what the minimum is and if it's really necessary. Power tools are not allowed. Your DeWalt drills, anything that has a motor on it, or gives you mechanical advantage, but it doesn't have to be gas powered like a chainsaw. Battery powered, electric powered. It's got a motor and gives you that electric, or it gives you an advantage of some kind. Those are not to be used. Same with wagons. We can't do wagons, wheelbarrows, other ways of giving you of mechanical transport. That's the portion of mechanical transport. So, which is a prohibited use under the Wilderness Act. And just a reminder, it's not supposed to be easy. These are the traditional skills that are that we all try to maintain as part of our mandate as being wilderness stewards. Having these skills, oftentimes doing it the traditional ways, isn't much different than using some of the more common things that we use around our household, or other things that we work in our yard with. Making sure we're properly trained, it's generally going to be a good way to do that project, outside of having some of these other resources. So I know that can be a frustrating topic sometimes for some basic things, but some of those are we're going to stick pretty hard and fast with. All right, this is another fun one to work through. Emergencies. This falls into search and rescues, natural disasters, and any other emergency that might come up, wildfire. And Forest Service policy defines an emergency as inescapable urgency and temporary need for speed beyond that available by primitive means. If and when you have an emergency developing in your area, one of the first things we're trying to do is define if it's truly an emergency, which gets to that first quote on that first bullet there. Oftentimes, we apply the word emergency when sometimes it's not. Not saying every time. There's definitely emergencies out there. There's people that have life-threatening injuries. There are natural disasters that occur more regularly than they used to. And during that time, if there are things, if there are people that need to be rescued as part of that, then yes, we need to, most times do what we need to do. So a couple more specifics, search and rescue. I encourage you to work with your local EMS or whoever is in charge of search and rescue for your county or your particular area, and just let them know some of these things. If someone is on a cell phone and maybe can't, find their way out and is maybe a little dehydrated, and I'm just making a scenario up here. We might not need to go in with a couple ATVs cutting down trees to get to them really quickly. Maybe we can send up some hikers really quick and assess the situation and see how that goes. But once again, those are sometimes can be very sensitive situations, both with if you're dealing with families or as you're dealing with politics that may arise. This, there can always be these X factors coming into a lot of these specific case-by-case situations with search and rescue. So the more you can be out in front of it, it's recommended to have an MOU with your search and rescue organizations. I would recommend that if you think it's a possibility. At a minimum, try to meet with them and talk with them just so they know before something happens. Some of the areas that have more frequent search and rescues, I know, have these meetings and coordinate with those folks on a regular basis so that they know. And hopefully we're getting contacted as part of that process. Natural disasters, this is, we're talking fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever it might be. I want to stress on this one too is most of the time, once the actual event is over, and I'm more referencing everything but a wildfire, which is a little bit different. Once the event is over and it's kind of the situation has been assessed and there's no one, injured or needs rescuing or removal or anything like that. Most of the time, I'm going to put most in there, the emergency is over. Cleanup is not an emergency. Assessment is not an emergency. Well, I shouldn't say that. Once you've cleared it of that there's nobody injured or hurt in the area, assessment of the damage is not an emergency that would warrant motorized use or other things. The reason I say that and talking about emergencies is Forest Service policy for prohibited uses, say if we're going to use ATVs or chainsaws or helicopters or all these other motorized type equipment, the authority to approve those lies with the regional forester, who's a couple rungs up the ladder from where I work at the regional office in Atlanta. When we've determined that emergency is currently happening, all of those, except for one, which is bulldozers or tractors, are delegated down to the forest supervisor. Primarily just so we can make sure that we're addressing the emergency properly, especially if there are severely injured individuals out there or other things happening that, like the quote says, is urgent, and the primitive means that we would normally do this with isn't going to cut it this time, for them to make the appropriate decisions. So that's why that one's kind of important. And then the last bullet there is the minimum requirements analysis, or MRDGs. Technically, emergencies are not exempt from doing an MRA of some kind or an MRDG. Oftentimes, because if we're working in real time, these things are happening very quickly. Sometimes that MRA is a verbal conversation to make sure we're doing the minimum. If, looking at different alternatives, is a long line versus cutting in a helipad versus using a UTV versus using chainsaws to widen a trail corridor, all those things, making sure we're doing the minimum. And then sometimes it's documented afterwards. So this is going, we're not slowing things down to respond to a true emergency with paperwork. And there are some forms developed primarily for wildfire to help document and while expediting some of that process. We don't have any of those for, say, hurricane response, or tornadoes, or other weather events, or search and rescue at this point. So there was a lot in that slide and got into the weeds a little bit, but this is one that folks always want to know about. And I would venture some folks on this call have already dealt with search and rescues or natural disaster in wilderness and or along the Appalachian Trail this year, I would assume, because it happens frequently. All right, and I wanted to finish off because I highlighted a lot of the intersections that maybe have us butting heads sometimes, or there's just different opinions on what the process is and what we should and shouldn't do. But the benefits of the management intersection of wilderness and the Appalachian Trail can't be understated either. I don't think there'd be a lot of disagreement that wilderness offers the highest level of protection for the Appalachian Trail. It's the highest level of protection out there for public lands. It's that can't be understated. You know, it offers this unique opportunity, particularly in the Southeast, to challenge yourself more. I'm not, you know, doing a through hike or even a section hike or anything, or hiking parts of the AT is definitely a challenge, however you look at it. But these areas that go through wilderness offer that unique part of a primitive and unconfined rec opportunity. Hopefully you can find some solitude, maybe if you're out during the week, or you know, not during some peak times, but those are real. When you, I mean, it's 125 miles of the AT in the southern region. So that's a great resource, and what I would think is a very important part of the AT experience in the Southeast. Expanded partnerships. You're part of one right now with the Wilderness Skills Institute, where we've brought together Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, the ATC, AT clubs, the Forest Service, regional office. All of our forests are heavily engaged in this partnership that we have, and it goes way beyond that. You know, ATC, SAWS, and the Forest Service obviously partner with many more organizations that we bring into the fold. This partnership is used as a model and looked at as a model for how to do partnerships. And that's something I'm pretty proud of. And I know a lot of folks on this call are as well. Additional funding opportunities. You know, wilderness, the Appalachian Trail, and trails in general, those connections can get you funding because they all come together in so many ways. Whether it's, you know, wilderness stewardship performance, money from the Washington office on the Forest Service side, or externals through National Forest Foundation or other groups. There's just, you know, you've broadened your scope by making those connections with the Appalachian Trail and wilderness. And then just overall broadening our community. That's, you know, I'm glad we went through the intro. It's great to see new people. And I think on every WSI opportunity I've had, we've brought more people together because of wilderness and the Appalachian Trail. And that's really important. You know, I wish we were together and, you know, we could form some stronger bonds and friendships, you know, at the cradle, like Eric said. But this is one of the reasons we're doing this summer series now, is to stay engaged with our community and to broaden it. And that's what I got. And Stephen, I just remembered you have a portion after me. For some reason, I was checking my clock thinking I was wrapping this thing up. So I'm going to skip my little what did I miss question slide here, because I forgot you still have more going on. I apologize.
Well, you're all good, and this will not be as much as before. And Pete, I'll try to take your feedback and try to not talk so fast. So I'll try to take it from trap rapper, auctioneer down to an acceptable drawl or speed. But
I hope I wasn't talking too fast either.
no, you are ideal actually, so people could hear you. I was going crazy fast. But yeah, I'm gonna hop right into it, and so we can finish out this first session really quickly. So hold on just a moment. Oh, looks like a wedding picture's up on the.
John, no questions came up in the chat while you were doing your session.
Sounds good. Sounds like we might have a few minutes, maybe at the end of Stephen's conversation here, and we'll see if we get any takers.
Yeah, I've only got about 10 slides on this one. So, and I'm not gonna, like I said, cover as much information. But that being said, with all this context with the Appalachian Trail, the wilderness, John is completely right that wilderness can only benefit the Appalachian Trail experience as well as the corridor that we are looking to strengthen and keep strong as the generations go on. Appalachian Trail Conservancy took on the term of the Wild East a couple of years ago, really to talk about that big corridor that goes up is the spine of the East, where the vast majority of the population lives within a day's drive of. So that being said, with all the folks around there too, and that it is a 2,000-mile trail, it's not quite realistic with the amount of people that live around it for it to be 100% wilderness, I will say, again, in my humble opinion. So that being said, treating it as the monolith or kind of managing to one trail standard would be a bit of a misnomer, would only kind of steer us wrong. I think the strength of this long trail is in the diversity of its experiences, from the opportunities of isolation in the 24 wilderness areas John was talking about, to the small town nightlife. You have not gone out until you've checked out, your Duncannons, your Hot Springs, your Glasgow's, a lot of delightful AT trail towns that some of which the trail goes directly through, which I would have no other way, because it is firmly into the culture of the AT. That being said, with all the people that continue to go outside, with those communities going, the Appalachian Trail is extraordinarily popular, and it doesn't take a professional to know in this past year, even more people have been going outside. So how we manage those masses is very important to keep from wilderness areas as well as the entire Appalachian Trail from degrading. So that being said, for our keen example and for closing us out today, I really want to go, there's no better place to see the diversity of adventure and stress on the trail than the good old Peach State. So I want us to go all down south to Georgia, shall we? All right. And forgive me, I'm a sucker for stacking maps, but the first 78 miles of the Appalachian Trail, the southernmost, go from Springer Mountain to Bly Gap. Originally, the start of the Appalachian Trail was Mount Oglethorpe, but it was moved for a more ideal route. As you can see, I'm looking at major cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, still big, but not mountain towns like Asheville and Chattanooga, all within a very close, smaller than a half day's drive to the Appalachian Trail. In those 78 miles, John mentioned there's 24 wilderness areas on the Appalachian Trail. 5 of those are in Georgia. The Southern Nantahala Wilderness from the most north, the Trey Mountain Wilderness Area, the Raven Cliffs Wilderness Area, Mark Trail Wilderness, the Blood Mountain Wilderness. Those were all designated in a very quick 8-year span from 1984 to 1991, where a lot of those eastern wildernesses were popping off between 74 and 94. So really, that being said, over those 78 miles, them going through or having those wilderness areas around the Appalachian Trail, to say it very AT-centered, makes for all that much more managerial difficulties, as well as we have a lot of other bright and shining things that are outside of wilderness. The very start of the approach trail being Immaculate Falls is, I think, the largest cascading waterfall in the east. But yeah, it brings in all sorts of people with that many people within a day's drive. And that being said, I want to check into a little bit of the spectrum of visitors that we get. As we look at this technical chart supplied by Semirad, a pretty good Instagram page, we can see the brackets or the range of folks that we get on through hikes specifically, and even on the Appalachian Trail going all the way down to glampers, of course. So on the same day of the start of a through hike, you may have someone who has never hiked before who could quit before they get to the Springer parking lot, or that same person could be starting the first day of their Triple Crown going to the PCT CDT Appalachian Trail. It's amazing about the Appalachian Trail in particular is that it draws that kind of novice hikers. I through hiked with a friend who had never backpacked before, who has now done 5 national scenic trails, including the CDT, PCT, and Appalachian Trail, including an extra 500 miles of side trails while he was on the AT. So really, I think it's that shelter aspect that really brings the most people, but again, conflicts with that amount of people. I tagged all the way into Bear Grylls on this list because his son, Matheson Grills, through hiked the AT in 2018. So basically the same thing. Real quick, breaking down the AT through hiking specifically now, because we're getting this massive northbound through hiking bubble, as a lot of you guys know, going through Georgia. Regardless of if they make it all the way to Maine, make it wherever they do, they're going to start and maybe quit in Georgia. So we see everyone. including a lot more people than necessarily register that goes by these particular stat lines. But the vast majority of folks start between March 1st and April 16th, and we get between 3,000 and 8,000 people kind of hiking on the AT during that section. That's a lot of people during those 45 days generally to see that big bubble. Now, real quick, I'm going to go, feel free to unmute yourself or chat. Why, oh, why was there a gigantic spike in 2000 for Appalachian Trail use? As you guys are filling out those answers, I'm just going to go ahead and keep talking, of course, because I can't keep silence for more than 2 seconds. You can continue to see these through hikers kind of glide on. I'm sorry, did some people unmute to answer that question?
Bill Bryson.
Bill Bryson, thank you. Yes, we got a good old Bryson bump in 2000. So yeah, it was a massive big push that caught a lot of my previous colleagues off guard as they kind of found out about the book the same time as y'all did. No, Bill Bryson did not work with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy or anything along those lines. So yeah, so there was a lot that went on and a lot of reaction going on, but a lot of notoriety that came with the Appalachian Trail with that book. I know a lot of people that I talk to still bring up that book all the time, which I have read myself. I've never actually read a book that fast, but I kind of anger read it at the time because of goes back and forth, or just a classic, maybe some misrepresentations of the trail experience. So that being said, when the 2010s hit and coming to 2015, there started to be talks about a movie that had been trying to be made for about since the book came out, which is A Walk in the Woods. So when that movie started to come out, a lot more worries started to come around Georgia with what exactly is going to happen. Are we going to get another Bryson bump? Thank God it was a terrible, terrible movie. And it did not do particularly well. It didn't break in the zeitgeist, and movies like Wild really took over a lot more. And if you look at a lot of the comparing stats on the PCT, they got a big Reese Witherspoon swole on that bad boy. But so really, even though we didn't see a lot of people with the movie coming out, we did see the Protecting the Appalachian Trail Hiking Experience Committee, or the PATH Committee, where the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club and the Forest Service and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, bringing it a little slower for you, Pete, and for anyone who actually wants to listen, really got going and really looked about the visitor use management tactics in Georgia in this first 80 miles of the Appalachian Trail. Luckily, we had Carrie Hollins, a master's in public policy student at Duke, who really went in and organized a lot of data that we already had existing. We were doing a good job of collecting a lot of data, of talking to people, but us trail folk like to be outside. We don't like to crunch the numbers. And luckily, we got this delightful Dookie to do a lot of good work. She came out with a good 80-page report working with the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club and the Forest Service, as well as working with a report that Jeff Marion had been collecting on a lot of different campsite inventories, as well as our current campsite inventories within the Forest Service, and then the ATC had already been collecting other campsite inventories. All this data had been brought together within this report, as well as following reports, to show how many campsites there were, exactly what kind of campsites there were, as in unapproved campsites were ones that were larger than ideal, too close to water, the soil had been degraded a considerable amount, things along those lines, all along a standard thought process in a campsite inventories with the Forest Service. So we found these massive amount of campsites, especially in the first chunks of the trail. So really looking at the campsite density and asking what we wanted these areas to actually look like. A dispersed camping strategy is amazing, especially in general Forest Service areas, but these are overnight numbers that we're seeing in these 45 days that are extraordinary, really. There's not a lot of big, massive migrations like this outside of religious pilgrimages throughout the world. So determining the desired conditions for each of the area along the Appalachian Trail was kind of the next step. It started in a zoning process that was started into 3 zones and then broke into 5 zones. Really, this is the idea, is to simplify, not just starting out with Georgia, but really would be hopefully the entire Appalachian Trail. What is the desired conditions for these areas along the trail? I know we're throwing some numbers out for y'all. If you ever want to remember exactly the zoning process, wilderness is number 1. That's all you got to go with. So, which also helps enable just the start of it, since we already have wilderness areas to start on, and brings a pretty good standard for this is the highest standard of trail we are holding things to. So as we went on from there, we set zones at the same time committees with the Forest Service, AT, GATC this entire time over a 2-year period. We are assigning those zones. I'll show you exactly what the meaning of those zones were more particularly that we decided over that period in the next slide. But we overlaid those zones over the period depending on what we thought should be the desired condition. Again, going mostly by the GATC's lead on this, but still with the Forest Service and the AT. So as you can see on here, this is a map I'd love to share with anyone that wants to see as I'm kind of keep moving through to finish this out. But they have the wide variety of zones throughout Georgia. Yes, predominantly a wilderness experiences we're seeing with these 5 wilderness trails, as well as still looking for good excuses to hold things to a wilderness standard in that small W, zone 2. And just to look outside of Georgia for a second, other areas that we're still managing a small W wilderness all the time, the Great Smoky Mountains Wilderness. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I just think of it as the Great Smoky Mountain Wilderness. Even though the National Park manages wilderness a considerable amount differently, they hold it to all the same Wilderness Act standards. So it's, and same thing with Baxter State Park in Maine. Even though it's a state park, Governor Baxter gifted that land to the state of Maine with express circumstances on how it should be managed and maintained. And it has been able to keep it that because he also included an endowment. So again, over this 2-year period, as we're deciding exactly what thresholds we want to hold each of these zones to. So exactly how many people do we think should go by a particular point in each one of these areas for a particular time? How many campsites should we have in each one for a mile of zone 1 compared to a mile of zone 4? So we went through this process dictated to the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council that goes through all the major federal land managers and picked out our own indicators and set our own threshold levels. Very much drafting this process and learning as we're going along. This also took years of, a couple years of deliberation getting to whatever numbers you're seeing. And these are very much draft numbers. As of now, we are collecting data against these numbers to kind of see exactly where the zones that we've outlaid and how they are compared to what we are calling ideal. We may find that some of our indicators and thresholds are just ill-placed, that is just inconceivable. Our plan is not legislation, so we can move it around as much as we do and see fit. We've set these numbers in stone for a year to kind of collect some stats and come back to it after a while. But as you can see, it has started out with setting wilderness at that zone 1 and holding wilderness to a higher standard of the other parts of the Appalachian Trail. We're not looking to kind of sacrifice any other areas, but we're looking for other parts outside of wilderness that it makes more sense to disperse use. One of the ways that we've done that since 2015 is we're looking at the Hawk Mountain campsite here. So this is a side hill, as you can see in the topo map. This is a side hill trail that has a lot of side hill campsites, all in the Jeff Marion design. This is a way that we drastically increased campsite capacity, overnight capacity in an area outside of a wilderness area. We have we set up enough facilities to make it as easy as possible. So the first tent pad is very easily identifiable, just just about 100 feet off the trail, if even that far. In some of these areas, we've even included privies, including this area. So, like I was saying, it's one of the more important parts. But this really gives the manager and our maintainers and the ATC a chance to pick a sustainable area and a sustainable design to be able to give people an opportunity to stay here, rather than the Park Service, Smokies, designated camping now telling people this is where you have to stay. This is more of a, if you build it, they will come. Because at the end of the day, where people are staying is where they know campsite is. It's the one that they're seeing directly on the trail. It's where their blisters are giving up. But if we have Hawk Mountain campsite with a ton of capacity on the map, then this is something that they can know and plan around and go to. Also, when you're including stuff like this into a system, it's important that we continue to maintain these tent pads. So adding on more maintainers as part of this process is something else the GATC did to keep those tent pads nice and flat and attractive for through hikers. Other things we did was our Ridge Runner program, the Start Smart at the Arch. This is the start of the approach trail. We had, I think, 58 hours of a 15-minute program where we have a ridge runner just talking about the bare basics for through hiking. So we can just cover on the major impacts that they're getting to help how they're going to poop outside. They show them how to do a bear hang. Now we've got bear canisters down there, but it's a 15-minute program geared directly towards through hikers that we're constantly evaluating and getting better, including the ridge runners that we already have on trail regularly, specifically doing that during that bubble season, and volunteer ambassadors that do the same on the ground education as a wilderness ranger or a ridge runner throughout the year on a volunteer basis, because it's another great volunteer opportunity, because not everyone wants to swing a tool all the time. It's kind of nice to just hike to your prettiest spot and chat some people up. Also very fun to do. Kind of can't stop doing it. Another thing we started doing in 2015 and 16 is we started our own online volunteer Jrsa permitting system, where people can sign up for their start date, in particular when they're starting a northbound through hike or southbound or flip-flop of anything, and see how many other people have started on that time. So as you can see on here, we set a threshold this year of 38 because the shelters were still closed for the majority of the through hiking season. So we brought that down from a 50 is what we normally keep it, what we've deemed as the capacity or overnight capacity for a through hiker cycle, overnight cycle, and kind of kept it to, we're asking people to stay around that line. It's a quick and easy feedback where people start to sign up for different days. It's the easiest way that we push people off of the weekends. The Fridays and Saturdays closest to April 1st and March 15th get slammed. And this is just an easy way to just provide some feedback, as well as most people don't want to start at the same time as 200 people. And at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense for one night or 2 nights a year where we have 100 people needing a campsite all within one area, if we can disperse this area to that 50-person limit with established campsites that are sustainable. So these are just a couple things that we've done, including also hang tags. This is just another feedback for people signing up, where it just gives a little bit of leave no trace, but this is just enough of a free thing that people have loved, and been so pissed off that we stopped giving it to them during the pandemic. So it's just another thing we've been able to pull people in more, encourage them to sign up and go through our channels to kind of maybe get them to do that Start Smart with the Art program. So that being said, we're still implementing that data collection. We're still learning a lot. We're hiring for a position in Georgia to kind of accelerate this continued visitor use management work. And it's really important that we keep adapting to our current system. We're not trying to bite off too much more than we can chew at any point in time. But we've certainly learned a lot. I tried to touch on a number of different programs that hopefully y'all can do. I've made some mistakes here. And maybe try out to your forest or your neck of the woods. Thank you all so much. And here now I can see the chat.
Great. Thanks, Stephen and John. I think we're good, and we can open up the floor to questions. And so if you want to unmute yourself and ask away, put the panelists in the hot seat for a while.
What do you disagree with, Pete?
Oh, I disagree that the National Park Service manages wilderness the same way. And I guess I just want to make the point that none of the Smokies is wilderness. It's backcountry by convenience, not capital W wilderness by legislation. Beyond that, though, I would just say that, I think it's important for us to recognize that although the Appalachian National Scenic Trail travels through 75 or more different public land ownerships from Georgia to Maine, and although in the National Wilderness Preservation System, there are 4 public land managing agencies, that when we're talking about the nexus of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail and wilderness, we're very much talking about national forest wilderness. There's only 2 miles of the AT that is in National Park Service wilderness. And we're also very much not just talking about Forest Service wilderness, but we're talking about Forest Service wilderness in the southern region of the Forest Service. There is very little of the AT that is in 4 wildernesses in Vermont and one wilderness in New Hampshire. So when we're talking about that nexus, when we're talking about that connection between the Appalachian National Scenic Trail and designated wilderness, we're very much talking Forest Service Region 8 in the South. I just want to say thanks. I've learned a lot.
I always knew we were special, Pete, in the southern region.
Yeah, and yeah, I wholeheartedly agree that, and just on the part on all that. Yes, of course, the Smokies is what I was getting to mention is it manages small W wilderness, and the ATC very much likes to go along those standards. I know that the Smokies does the absolute best they can to stick to a wilderness standard. I was always a lot more pleased when I go into the backcountry office how much more wilderness paraphernalia is on the wall. What I have to say is that the zoo that goes through the Smokies that I've been working for the past couple of years has been an education. Is that the amount of people that go to the Smokies is just extraordinary. 12 months of the year, and the conflicts of it have just gone up exponentially. So yeah, management is very difficult to that area. And yes, it's not federally designated large W wilderness. And yeah, the Park Service does manage stuff differently, but I do respect the amount of management. It's not backcountry, I guess, by accident or anything. There's a lot to do to protect that backcountry, regardless of it being a big W wilderness. And minimum requirements analysis, all the same stuff. The word trammel being thrown around. Now, I mean, no, never mind. I was about to just throw a stone, but I'm gonna skip it.
Hey, Stephen, you mentioned, I think, 265 shelters along the entire length of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. And I think Scotty did a quick count of, and has a reasonable number that may or may not be 100% correct, but it might be good for folks to hear how few of those shelters are in wilderness, if Scotty's willing to.
You're on mute, Scotty.
Sorry, technology. I did a quick count and I came up with 27 total shelters is what I counted on the AT, running from Georgia all the way up to Maine is what I counted, 27. And most of those, I think it was like 20 of them were in below the Shenandoahs and south, I think is what I got. I might have missed a couple, but I tried to do a real quick count.
Thank you, Scotty.
Yeah.
And Scotty's the best person to do it as a SAWS specialist, everything, and one of my finest maintainers in the Southeast.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I am going to delve deeper in this and make sure that my number is correct and actually count how many is in each wilderness or each state and then divide it up that way.
Awesome. I can tell you that we are looking to what areas we might be establishing more campsites in the future, but the ATC is not looking to build any more shelters. Replace, repair, yes. Maintain, yes.
I have a quick question. When John put up the poll about the privies and shelters, if we think that they should be in wilderness or not, I was thinking along the lines of, well, you know, why not just have those things like in the national forest, but outside of wilderness areas? I understand that a lot of those privies and shelters were in wilderness prior to designation. So that's a whole question of like, do we want to put in the effort of actually removing it? But what that was making me think about, though, if you were considering removing a shelter or a privy, and actually I was thinking even more so about the privies, is I'm wondering if there's any like scientific data, or even if Jeff Marion has done any research on like if you were to remove a privy, like what would the impacts be then if people were used to having that there? Would the impact to the wilderness actually be greater if you were to remove it than keep it? You know what I mean? Because part of me was like thinking, well, why don't we just leave the ones that are outside of wilderness and remove the ones that were inside? But maybe it's actually less impacts to have more frequent privies and shelters than not.
I'll take a stab and then Stephen might add to it. You know, I think the original shelter locations and then privies subsequently were based upon a certain schedule of where folks could regularly, you know, go on a day basically. So that's how they ended up in those particular locations. And as a recreation manager for almost 20 years, when you put a facility in somewhere, whether it's a toilet, a garbage can, a camping pad, whatever it might be, you know, in the back of my head, I'm always thinking is once it's there, you're probably never going to be able to get rid of it. There's some things you can get rid of, but people become accustomed to it and they don't like to lose what they have. I don't know if the impacts would be, you know, more or less or the same. You know, I think that's where you look at, you know, how use is changing and how, you know, how things are going in those directions. But yeah, it would be a tough one. And I know when we looked at potentially moving, you know, one shelter out of wilderness, I can't remember the specific example. A lot of those shelter locations are also based upon having a water source. So that, you know, it's all, the locations where folks are camping are all encapsulated what they need to, you know, basically have water. And moving it 2 miles down the road or something like that, or, you know, the shelter, there might outside the wilderness boundary, there might not be a water source there. And Stephen, if you have anything to add, and then Pete, we can maybe go to you really quick, and then we probably got to wrap up to be respectful of folks' time. I know we're losing a couple folks already.
Yeah, so I agree with the idea too in general, because yeah, part of the zoning is to kind of have more opportunities outside of a wilderness area and kind of draw those impacts away. Now, if something's sitting right outside of a wilderness area, I think a lot of schools or thoughts are, if you're walking by it on the way to the wilderness, it's part of the wilderness no matter what. It all depends on the expectation people have for that area. I know whether it's an overnight or whether it's max patch, people really expect a lot of times for there to be bathrooms, especially on the Appalachian Trail. I say max patch in particular because it takes an hour to get there from anywhere, and we have an exorbitant amount of toilet paper presence that we're monitoring right now. If we can change people's expectations away from that or really push them towards existing bathrooms in a lot of situations, that can kind of relieve that pressure. But I'm personally having a harder time for over a decade plus of, you know, making my own how to poop outside interpretation that I brought to SAWS. It's hard to change the minds of people, and especially if they have a full bladder, and especially a poor planned person, which is what we a lot of see, spontaneous recreation, let's call it, rather than poor planned. So it's hard to manage around that. It's half of the lowest common denominator. But
Pete, can you encapsulate in about 30 seconds so we can wrap up?
Sure. Leah, excellent question. Yes, there is Dr. Jeff Marion recreation ecologist research, at least showing that a shelter site in wilderness concentrates use and leaves more of the wilderness undeveloped, natural, and undisturbed. Number two is there's real life shelter with no privy in Northeast Tennessee. Shelter on a railroad grade with acres of toilet flowers around it because there's no privy. That's all, John. More than 30 seconds.
You did great, Pete. Thanks for that. I got the mic. I'll just say thank you all for joining. We've lost a few folks already. Thanks for taking the time. Hope to see you in one of the future sessions. And please feel free to share it amongst your friends and networks to join for the future ones. The next one up next is partnerships with a great cast of Forest Service, SAWS, and ATC volunteer partner extraordinaires. So please come and check that one out if you have any interest. Everyone have a great day, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.